He kissed my cheek, cheap cologne mixing with the night rain. "We should take a break," he said. 3 weeks ago, I wired $80,000 to save his family from predatory debt. Tonight, he left me for my own sister. His mother just smirked, as if it were her plan all along. I don't cry. I work in compliance. At Brightmore Dynamics, I turn betrayal into an evidence file. My name is Ray Whitlock. I am 32 years old, and my world is one of controlled variables and documented actions. The city of North Arden operates on a similar principle, a network of glass and steel arteries humming under a perpetually overcast sky. Tonight, a fine, persistent mist slicked the streets, blurring the halogen lights of the corporate campus into watercolor streaks on my windshield. The headquarters of Brightmore Dynamics loomed ahead, a monument to structured ambition, its dark glass skin reflecting the bruised twilight. Even at this hour, the employee parking structure glowed with a sterile white light that promised nothing and stripped everything of its warmth. It was a light I understood. It was the light of scrutiny. I pulled my sedan into my designated spot, P4, Level G. A small perk of being the head of internal compliance. My job is to be the company's immune system. I identify, document, and neutralize threats from within. Fraud, conflicts of interest, data breaches. They are all just narratives waiting to be unraveled, patterns hiding in plain sight. I find the loose thread and I pull, methodically, until the entire flawed tapestry comes undone. It is a job that requires a particular kind of detachment, an ability to look at human behavior as a series of inputs and outputs, of risks and consequences. I am very good at my job. Caleb was waiting for me near the glass doors leading to the main lobby, standing just outside the reach of the overhead canopy. The mist had beaded on the shoulders of his charcoal gray coat. He was a project manager in the technology division, a man whose professional life was built on timelines and deliverables. In our personal life, he'd built his image on a gentle smile and an easygoing charm that I had once mistaken for sincerity. Tonight, that smile was in place, a perfectly calibrated curve of his lips. But his eyes were scanning the wet asphalt somewhere past my left shoulder. They wouldn't meet mine. That was the first data point. "Hey," he said, his voice a little too soft, designed to soothe before the strike. He leaned in to kiss my cheek, and a foreign scent, cheap and cloyingly sweet, like synthetic berries, mingled with the clean, damp smell of the night rain. It was not my perfume. It was not a scent I had ever known him to wear. Data point number 2. He pulled back, his hands finding his pockets, a classic tell of defensive posturing. "Ray, we need to talk." I remained still, my briefcase a solid weight in my hand. "We are talking, Caleb." "No, I mean, talk." He finally looked at me, a quick darting glance before his gaze fled again. I think we should take a break." The words hung in the air, seemingly simple, utterly devastating. A break, a corporate-sanctioned euphemism for termination, repurposed for a marriage. As he said it, under the unforgiving white light of the parking structure, I saw it. On the crisp white collar of his shirt, just below the jawline, was a faint, almost invisible smudge of coral pink lipstick. It was a shade my younger sister, Tessa, had been wearing exclusively for the past 6 months. Data point number 3. The pattern was beginning to emerge. My own phone, resting in my coat pocket, vibrated with a single, sharp buzz, a notification. I didn't need to look, I already knew. But in my line of work, you don't act on suspicion, you act on confirmation. I kept my expression neutral, a mask honed in countless tense internal reviews. "A break," I repeated, my voice flat. "What does that entail?" He flinched at my tone, at the absence of the hysterics he was clearly expecting. "I just need some space, Ray, to think. Things have been complicated." "Complicated," I echoed. My mind was already running checksums, cross-referencing recent events, his late nights at the office, his sudden guardedness with his phone, the way his mother, Irene, had stopped calling me for our weekly chats. The evidence had been there all along. A series of minor anomalies I had mistakenly filed under marital friction instead of active threat. A rookie mistake. I gave a slight nod. I see. He seemed relieved, taking my composure as acquiescence. I'll pack a bag tonight. Stay at my mom's for a bit. We can figure out the details later. He gave me that smile again. The empty one. Okay? I didn't answer. I simply turned and walked towards my car. The sound of my heels clicking a sharp, precise rhythm on the concrete. He didn't follow. As I slid into the driver's seat, I allowed myself to look at my phone. The message was from a number I didn't recognize, containing only a picture. No text. None was needed. The photo was clear, taken from across a crowded bar. The warm, amber glow of the Half Moon Bar. A place we used to go. Caleb was on one side of a small table, his head tilted in that charming way he had, and across from him, lifting a cocktail glass in a toast, was Tessa, my sister. Her coral pink lipstick was bright against the rim of the glass. Her smile was triumphant. They were not just having a drink, they were celebrating a victory. The image was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. Case confirmed. My training kicked in, overriding the hot surge of personal pain. Emotion is a contaminant. It clouds judgment. First, you secure the perimeter. You gather all relevant intelligence. I scrolled through my contacts, my finger hovering, then pressing on the name, Irene Rowan, my mother-in-law. She answered on the third ring, her voice slow and syrupy, as if she'd been expecting my call. Ray, dear, is everything all right? I kept my voice even. Irene, Caleb just told me he's taking a break, that he'll be staying with you. There was a pause, a small, deliberate space in the conversation where a normal person would feign surprise or offer comfort. Irene filled it with something else entirely, a quiet, satisfied hum. Well, she said, her voice laced with a cool condescension she no longer bothered to hide. Some women just aren't wife material, I suppose. The line went dead in my ears, but her words echoed in the sudden, crushing silence of my car. Wife material. The phrase was a dismissal, a final verdict. My mind flashed back 3 weeks, not to a romantic dinner or a shared laugh, but to the sterile environment of my bank's wire transfer portal, to the crisp, official PDF receipt that was still tucked into the main sleeve of my leather wallet. My hand trembled. Just once, as I reached for it, I pulled out the folded paper and smoothed it on the passenger seat. The numbers glowed under the dim interior light. $80,000. Destination, Rowan & Sons, HVAC repair. LLC, escrow account. Purpose, full and final settlement of outstanding debt. That money, my money, a carefully managed portfolio of savings, emergency funds, and cashed-out investments, had been the bridge, as Irene had put it, weeping at my kitchen table. The bridge to save their family business from a predatory loan that was about to swallow them whole. Some women just aren't wife material. And in that moment, under the cold, sterile lights of the Brightmoor Dynamics parking garage, everything snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. The gentle, helpless husband, the tearful, desperate mother-in-law, the charming, opportunistic little sister. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a coordinated operation, a long con, and I was the mark. They saw me as a resource to be exploited, a financial instrument, and now that the instrument had served its purpose, it was to be discarded. They had made a critical miscalculation. They had confused my stability for passivity, my generosity for weakness. They had forgotten what I do for a living. My job is to build a case. I establish timelines. I document non-compliance. I quantify damages. I identify all involved parties. I create risk profiles on individuals who pose a threat to the integrity of the system. They had just made themselves a threat. The initial shock, the raw personal agony of the betrayal, began to recede. It was being replaced by something colder, something harder, something infinitely more useful. Clarity, The grief was a liability. I compartmentalized it, sealed it behind a firewall of professional purpose. Ray Whitlock, the wife, was offline. Ray Whitlock, the head of compliance, was now in control. I turned off my phone, cutting off any further incoming data that might be emotionally compromising. My personal life was no longer a relationship. It was an incident to be managed. I reached into my briefcase and retrieved not a tissue, but a new, unopened notebook. It was a hardcover, black, with a reassuring heft. The paper inside was thick and smooth, designed for permanence. I clicked open the pen I reserved for drafting critical reports. On the first clean, white page, in my neat, precise handwriting, I wrote the title. It was the first step in any formal review. The first step in transforming chaos into order. The first step in building the case that would bring them all down. Rowan. Risk Events. V1. The engine of my car was silent. The only sound the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers pushing away the North Arden mist. Inside, the world was reduced to the clean, lined page of my notebook, and the stark heading I had just written. Rowan. Risk Events. V1. Each character was a small, controlled act of defiance against the chaos they had tried to impose on my life. My pen hovered over the page. A proper investigation begins with a timeline, establishing the inciting incident. For this, the inciting incident wasn't the kiss in the parking garage, it was the transaction that enabled it. My mind spooled back 3 weeks, the memory replaying with the cold clarity of a security recording. It was a Tuesday morning. The light in our kitchen was bright and optimistic, glinting off the stainless steel appliances I had paid for. Irene Rowan sat at my granite island, her face a carefully constructed mask of maternal despair. Her hands, usually adorned with gaudy rings, were clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. She hadn't touched the coffee I'd made her. The performance was everything. "I don't know what we're going to do. Ray," she'd whispered, her voice cracking expertly. "It's everything your father-in-law built, everything Caleb was supposed to inherit." She produced a single, perfect tear that traced a path down her powdered cheek. "We just need a bridge, just a little bridge to get us over this month." The bridge she needed was $80,000. The family business, Rowan and Sons HVAC Repair, a small, chronically mismanaged company that had been treading water for years, was about to go under. They had taken a loan not from a bank, but from a private lender whose name sounded more like a motorcycle gang than a financial institution. The terms were predatory, the interest rate usurious, and the final balloon payment was due. Default meant they would lose everything: the business, the building it was in, and potentially the family home they had leveraged as collateral. I listened with the practiced patience of a compliance officer conducting an interview. I asked for the paperwork. She produced a sheaf of documents that were as convoluted as they were threatening. I recognized the structure immediately. It was designed to be impossible to repay, ensuring the lender would seize the assets. It was legal, but only just barely. "Caleb is beside himself," she'd continued, twisting the narrative knife. "He can't sleep. He feels like such a failure, not being able to protect his family legacy. At the time, I saw a family in crisis. I saw my husband, a man I loved, buckling under a weight I could help lift. Now, I see a well-rehearsed script. They weren't asking for a handout. They were executing a planned extraction of capital." My response was not emotional. It was procedural. I told her I would look into it. I spent the next 48 hours doing my due diligence. I reviewed their business financials. They were a mess. I researched the lender. They had a trail of lawsuits and ruined small businesses in their wake. My conclusion was simple. The debt was toxic, but the business, if freed from it, was salvageable. My decision to help was based on a risk assessment. The risk of my husband's emotional and financial collapse versus the risk to my own capital. I chose to mitigate the family risk. I did not simply hand over a check. That is not how I operate. I structured the payment as a formal, arm's-length transaction, I engaged a third-party escrow attorney to handle the transfer. My personal savings and a significant portion of my emergency fund, money I had meticulously invested over a decade, were liquidated and wired to the attorney's trust account. He then negotiated the final payoff with the lender, ensuring the debt was settled in full and all liens against the Rowan properties were released. It was clean, it was professional, it was insulated. Before I initiated the wire, I had one final conversation with Irene. It took place over the phone. "This is a loan, Irene," I said, my tone clear and unambiguous. "I am happy to help the family, but this is my life savings. We need to agree on terms for repayment." "Of course, dear. Of course," she'd gushed, relief flooding her voice. "Anything you say." We agreed verbally to a repayment plan spread over 18 months, starting after a 3-month grace period. I knew a verbal agreement was weak, so I followed up immediately with an email summarizing our conversation. It detailed the amount, the purpose, and the repayment schedule. I attached a simple PDF receipt for her to sign. The subject line was "Personal Loan Documentation." I ended the email with a clear sentence. "Please digitally sign and return the attached receipt to confirm your acceptance of these terms and acknowledge this transfer as a personal loan from Ray Whitlock." She signed it and returned it within the hour. That digitally signed PDF, along with the wire transfer confirmation from the escrow attorney, went into a secure digital folder on my private server. I also had the audio recording of our phone call. The state of Norham, a place of legal idiosyncrasies, is a one-party consent state. As a participant in the conversation, my recording of it was perfectly legal. I document everything. It's not paranoia. It's good practice. The wire transfer cleared on a Wednesday. The sense of relief from the Rowan family was palpable, but it manifested in a way I hadn't anticipated. It manifested as silence. Irene, who had been calling me daily with tearful updates, stopped calling altogether. When I saw her the following Sunday for family dinner, she gave me a brittle hug and spoke of the weather. The $80,000 elephant in the room was ignored completely. Caleb's behavior shifted too. The late nights at the office began. The excuses were plausible, linked to a major project launch. I, a fool who still believed in the integrity of our partnership, gave him the benefit of the doubt. I saw a man working hard, not a man building a new life on my dime. Then came another data point, an anomaly I filed away without understanding its significance at the time. A week after the money cleared, my sister Tessa showed up at my office on the 28th floor of the Brightmoor Tower. She rarely ventured into the corporate world, preferring the fluid, Instagram-centric lifestyle of a part-time yoga instructor and aspiring influencer. She arrived unannounced, holding 2 coffees. "Thought my big-shot sister could use a pick-me-up," she chirped, her eyes darting around my corner office, taking in the view of the city skyline. She was a whirlwind of manufactured energy, all bright smiles and feigned interest in my work. She didn't stay long. On her way out, she paused by the bank of elevators in the lobby. The doors were mirrored, floor-to-ceiling polished steel. "Wow," she'd said, pulling out her phone and fluffing her hair. "These are great for selfies." She took a quick picture of her reflection, laughed, and then she was gone. It was a bizarre, pointless interaction, a loose thread I couldn't place. That night, the thread found its context. A friend sent me a link to a new Instagram profile. The username was some variation of Tessa's name with the word Lux appended to it. The profile picture was of her, pouting at the camera, and the very first post, dated that evening, was a professionally lit, carefully staged photo of a brand new designer handbag. It was a model that cost upwards of $5,000. The caption read, "Good things come to those who hustle. New beginnings manifesting." My sister, who a month prior had borrowed $200 from me for a car repair, was now manifesting a luxury handbag. The timing was improbable. Now, sitting in the damp chill of my car, the pieces were no longer just pieces. They were a mosaic of deceit, the desperate plea, the structured bailout, the immediate silence, the late nights, the sister's reconnaissance mission to my office, the sudden, inexplicable wealth. It was a timeline of betrayal, funded by my life savings. I uncapped my pen again. The emotional fog had completely lifted, replaced by the sharp, cold atmosphere of a pending audit. Under the heading, I drew 2 neat bullet points. My hand was perfectly steady. The first was a financial query, the starting point for any investigation into potential fraud. Source of funds? Tessa Whitlock, luxury goods. The second bullet point was more dangerous, more potent. It was an instinct, a connection my brain made between the personal and the professional. Tessa's odd visit to my office, Caleb's project, their sudden shared secrecy. My world had 2 spheres, and until now, I had kept them separate, but they had not afforded me the same courtesy. They had crossed the line. The sterile, rule-based world of Brightmoor Dynamics was my turf. It was where I was strongest, and I had a sudden, chilling suspicion that this was not just a family affair. It was a corporate one, too. Conflict at work? C. Rowan, T. Whitlock. I closed the notebook. The plan was not yet formed, but its foundation was solid. They thought they had taken my money and my husband. They thought the game was over. They didn't understand. They had just moved the game onto my home field, and in my field, I make the rules. The drive home was an automated process, my body executing the familiar turns and stops while my mind worked. The notebook sat on the passenger seat, its 2 bullet points a declaration of war. By the time I walked into the empty, silent apartment, our apartment, the personal grief had been fully transmuted into professional focus. Betrayal wasn't an emotion anymore. It was a case file. I didn't pour a drink. I didn't turn on the television. I walked straight to my home office, powered on my encrypted work laptop, and logged into the Brightmoor Dynamics network through a secure VPN. The battle had moved from the parking garage to the server farm. My work had begun. My first query was simple: a search of all active, high-value projects under Caleb Rowan's management. One project immediately dominated the results: Project Nightingale. It was the company's flagship initiative for the quarter, a massive bid to build and manage a secure cloud platform for sensitive medical data. It was a billion-dollar play, and Brightmoor was in the final stages of a competitive bidding process to be the primary contractor. Success meant a massive influx of revenue. Failure meant a significant hit to our stock price and reputation. The stakes were astronomical. I drilled down into the project's architecture. It was a complex ecosystem of proprietary software and third-party vendors. I pulled the vendor procurement list. Most were familiar names, industry giants we'd worked with for years. But one name was new: Alderbridge Tech. They were listed as a subcontractor responsible for a critical data integration module. According to the file, they were a boutique firm, recently onboarded, specializing in rapid deployment solutions. Caleb, as the lead project manager for the technical integration, had been the one to champion their inclusion. His signature was on the initial scope of work approval. Alderbridge Tech. The name meant nothing to me. I ran it through our standard third-party due diligence database. The company was young, founded just 2 years ago, financially solvent, but with a thin operational history. I pulled up their corporate leadership profile. The CEO was a name I didn't recognize. The CFO, the same. But the key account manager assigned to the Brightmoor project, the primary point of contact, was a man named Theron Vale. The name hit me like an electric shock. Theron Vale, my mind, a finely tuned instrument for connecting disparate data points, immediately found the file. 3 years ago, Tessa had dated a musician for a few months. His name was Marcus Vale. He had an older brother who worked in tech, an ambitious guy she'd complained was allergic to fun. His name was Theron. In the world of compliance, there are no coincidences. There are only undisclosed relationships. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my search parameters now laser-focused. Using my administrative access privileges, I initiated a targeted keyword search of the company's email server archives. The search terms were Caleb Rowan, Alderbridge, and Theron Vale. I was looking for a pattern, an anomaly. It didn't take long to find it. Buried in a chain of routine project updates was an email from Caleb to the head of IT infrastructure, sent 2 weeks ago. The subject line was Urgent, Nightingale Temp Access. In it, Caleb requested temporary, high-level administrative access to one of the project's sandboxed data repositories for an external consultant from Alderbridge. This was a flagrant breach of protocol. All external access required a multi-stage approval process, including a formal review by my department. Caleb had bypassed it entirely. Citing a tight deadline and the need for agile problem-solving, the access had been granted for a 12-hour window, from 7:00 p.m. to 7:00 a.m. on a Thursday night. The justification was flimsy, the action a clear violation. The email gave me a date and time. My next move was to the physical world. I queried the building's visitor management system, SecurePass v4.1. I searched for any guests signed in by Caleb Rowan on the night in question. The system returned 0 results. I broadened the search, looking for any visitors from Alderbridge Tech. Again, nothing. It was too clean. He was covering his tracks. But I knew my systems. I ran a new query, this time for all non-employee entries into the building between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. on that Thursday. I wasn't looking for a name. I was looking for the sponsor. The list was short: a handful of cleaning crew, 2 late-night couriers, and 1 guest. The guest's name was listed as Tessa Carter. Her sponsor was Caleb Rowan, in the reason for visit field. The entry read, Rowan Family Matter. Tessa Carter, a clumsy, almost insulting attempt at misdirection. She had used a different last name but hadn't been able to resist tying herself to the family name in the notes. It was arrogant. It was sloppy. It was exactly the kind of mistake a novice would make. With the timestamp and the falsified name, I had what I needed to pull the surveillance footage. I sent a priority request to the corporate security office. 15 minutes later, an encrypted video file arrived in my inbox. I clicked play. The camera angle was from the main lobby, wide and sterile. At 7:13 p.m., the elevator doors opened. Caleb walked out, followed by Tessa. He swiped his access card at the security turnstile, holding it open for her. They walked together across the polished marble floor, his hand resting briefly on the small of her back. They were not discussing a family matter. They were a team arriving for a job. Now I had a timeline: breach of digital protocol, followed by a breach of physical security, all under a falsified pretext. But I was missing the motive. In my world, the motive is always money. I logged into the accounts payable system. My final stop. I filtered all invoices submitted by Alderbridge Tech in the last 30 days. There were 2. The first was a standard, scheduled payment for the completion of the first project milestone, the one Caleb had signed off on. The second, however, was an outlier. It was a separate invoice for $12,000. It had been submitted the morning after Tessa's late-night visit. The line item description was vague. Project Nightingale, ad hoc consulting services. The invoice had been approved for payment by Caleb. There it was, the complete sequence. The undisclosed personal relationship, the breach of protocol to grant unauthorized access, the clandestine after-hours meeting, the immediate, suspicious payment for consulting. This was not just a case of my husband having an affair with my sister. This was a potential kickback scheme, using my sister as a courier or ghost consultant, funneling company money through a vendor controlled by an associate. The $5,000 handbag was not a gift from a new lover. It was a payout. My hands were steady as I opened the compliance case management portal. I created a new file. Case CID 774A9. Title: Potential Conflict of Interest and Irregular Payment Vendor Relations. To ensure my own impartiality and to protect the investigation from any accusations of personal bias, I immediately encoded the parties involved. Caleb became Employee Y. Alderbridge Tech became Vendor X. Tessa became Associated Third Party Z. I, Ray Whitlock, was simply the investigator. With the preliminary case file built, I logged off. There was one more step to take tonight. I walked down the hall, my heels silent on the hardwood floors, and stopped outside the door to the spare bedroom. I could hear the faint sound of Caleb moving around inside, packing his things. I felt nothing. He was no longer my husband. He was employee Y. I left the apartment and took the elevator down to the street. The mist had thickened into a light drizzle. I walked the 2 blocks to Neil Carr's building. Neil was Brightmoor's general counsel, a sharp, unflappable man in his 50s with a deep-seated hatred for corporate malfeasance and a healthy respect for my department's work. I sent him a single text. Urgent. Need 5 minutes. In your lobby. His reply was immediate. Come up. I found him in his home office, a room lined with law books and smelling of leather and old paper. He was still in his suit, minus the tie. He gestured for me to sit. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the facts, and only the facts. Project Nightingale. We have a potential conflict of interest with a new subcontractor. Vendor X. I walked him through the data points with cold precision. The undisclosed personal relationship between an employee's relative and the vendor's account manager, the breach of data access protocols, the after-hours building access under a false name, the suspicious $12,000 consulting fee that immediately followed. I never used a single name. It was all codes and case numbers. Neil listened without interruption. His eyes narrowed. His hands steepled under his chin. He understood the implications immediately. A kickback scheme on a project this sensitive could not only derail the bid, but could trigger an SEC investigation. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. He looked at me, his gaze analytical. Your evidence is circumstantial, but creates a compelling timeline. The missing piece is the money trail. The invoice went to vendor X. You need to show a corresponding flow of funds from vendor X or an associated party to employee Y or the third party. I know, I said. That requires access to personal financial records. I can't subpoena those. He nodded slowly. No, you can't. He glanced at the clock on his wall. It was nearly midnight. The Nightingale Steering Committee meets at 8 a.m. tomorrow. The CEO will be there. So will representatives from Alderbridge. If this is happening, I need to know before that meeting. He stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the wet, glittering streets of North Arden. This is your case, Ray. You have my full support. Find me something concrete that connects the vendor's money to your employee. He turned to face me, his expression grim. If you find any evidence of a personal transfer, a bank statement, a wire confirmation, anything, I want it on my desk before 6 a.m., not a minute later. It was a directive. It was a deadline. It was a declaration of war. Understood, I said, rising to my feet. The hunt was on, and I had exactly 6 hours to find the kill shot. I had 6 hours to find a smoking gun. My corporate databases were exhausted. The next step required a source of intelligence I couldn't access through a terminal. The human element, specifically, the weakest link in the chain. As I was mapping out potential approaches, my phone, which I had switched back on, lit up with a text message. It was from Tessa. Hey Ray, I heard about you and Caleb. So sorry. Can we talk? Face to face? I feel like you deserve an honest conversation. The timing was impeccable. The message was a masterclass in feigned sympathy. It was also an invitation to an ambush. She wanted to control the narrative, to play the reluctant homewrecker and paint me as the cold, career-obsessed wife who had driven her husband away. She was coming to deliver the coup de grace. An amateur would have refused. An emotional wreck would have unleashed a torrent of rage. I did neither. I saw the invitation for what it was, an opportunity, an interview with a key subject. I replied with a single, coolly composed sentence. Where and when? She suggested the Gilded Cage, a bar downtown that tried to cultivate a rustic, speakeasy vibe with filament bulbs, reclaimed wood, and a soundtrack of mournful, old-school country music. It was a place designed for intimate confessions and bad decisions. It was perfect. The low lighting would be an asset. Before I left my apartment, I calibrated my equipment from a small case in my office safe. I selected a micro camera, no larger than a shirt button. I expertly threaded it into the cuff of my black blazer. the tiny lens indistinguishable from the other buttons. I ran a quick audio and video test on my phone. The picture was clear, the sound was crisp, the stage was set. I arrived first, choosing a small, isolated booth in the back. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey and stale perfume. When Tessa walked in, she scanned the room, a brief flicker of disappointment crossing her face when she saw I was already there, already in a position of control. She had wanted me to be the one walking into her scene. She slid into the booth opposite me, arranging her new $5,000 handbag on the seat beside her with deliberate care. She was wearing a silk blouse in a shade of cream that was meant to look innocent. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice a soft purr. "I know this must be hard." I said nothing. I simply watched her, letting the silence stretch. In an interrogation, the first person to fill the silence is the one who is losing. She faltered, her practiced sympathy wavering. "Look, I just want you to know, it wasn't planned. It just happened. Caleb and I, we found each other. He wasn't happy. Ray, you were always so busy, so focused on your work. He needed someone who could see him." The speech was so full of cliches it was almost boring. She was delivering lines from a soap opera, and she expected them to land with devastating emotional force. I let her finish, my expression unreadable. My only response was a question, my voice low and even, cutting through her manufactured drama. "Where did you get the money for the purse, Tessa?" The question caught her off guard. It wasn't part of her script. A flash of anger, quickly suppressed, tightened her eyes. She forced a tinkling laugh. "Wow, okay, straight to that." She leaned forward, her tone turning conspiratorial and condescending. "I have a new benefactor, a friend, someone who appreciates me. Let's just say good things happen to good people, people who are open to life." "I see," I said. "So this benefactor is generous, more generous than the $80,000 I gave to Caleb's family 3 weeks ago?" I watched her face carefully as I said the number. It was a test. Her reaction was telling. There was no surprise, no guilt. There was only a flicker of annoyance, as if I had brought up an old, irrelevant debt. "Oh, that," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "That was sweet of you. Ray, you were helping his family. That's what family does." She didn't see it as a loan to be repaid. She saw it as a sunk cost, my cost, the price of my admission into their family, a membership that had just been revoked. In her mind, the money was gone, absorbed into the Rowan ecosystem to which she now belonged. She felt entitled to it. It was in this moment, as she spoke with such casual, breathtaking arrogance, that I saw it. She reached for her cocktail, a ridiculously pink concoction, and as the sleeve of her blouse slid back, I saw the tattoo. It was small, a delicate piece of black linework on the inside of her wrist. 2 letters, intertwined in a clean corporate-style font. A B. My mind processed it instantly. A. B. Alderbridge. She had branded herself. She was so proud of her little con, so certain of her victory, that she had permanently inked the logo of her benefactor onto her own skin. It was the most damning, arrogant, and stupidly beautiful piece of evidence I could have possibly hoped for. I let my eyes linger on her wrist for a beat too long, and she noticed. She instinctively pulled her sleeve down, a flicker of panic in her eyes. Too late. The image was already logged in my memory, and more importantly, captured by the lens on my cuff. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer. Then I reached into my own purse, but I didn't pull out my wallet. I pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. I smoothed it out and placed it in the center of the table, next to the flickering candlelight. It was the digitally signed PDF, the escrow receipt, the email confirmation of the personal loan from Ray Whitlock. Irene Rowan's signature was clear at the bottom. Tessa stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. "You said good things happen to good people," I said, my voice still quiet, but now edged with the hardness of polished steel. "I agree. I also appreciate good paperwork. It keeps things clear." The color drained from her face, the implications of the document, of my calm, procedural demeanor, finally began to sink in. This wasn't a tearful confrontation between sisters. This was an audit. She was being audited. The confident, victorious woman who had walked in a few minutes ago was gone, replaced by a cornered, panicked girl. What is that?" she stammered. "It's a record," I said, "of a transaction. I keep meticulous records of all my transactions. It's part of my job." While her mind was reeling, trying to process this new, unwelcome reality, I took out my phone. I brought up a text message chain with Caleb. My thumbs moved quickly. "I know about Alderbridge. I know about Tessa. I have the documentation for the $80,000 loan. I have prepared a temporary financial separation agreement. It freezes all joint assets pending a full review. Sign it tonight, or my next call is to Neil Carr with a full disclosure. You have 1 hour." I hit send. Across the table, Tessa watched me, her eyes wide. I placed my phone face up on the table. A moment later, under Caleb's name, the 3 small dots of the typing indicator appeared. They danced for a moment, a frantic, silent signal of his panic on the other end of the line. Then, they vanished. No reply came. The silence was his answer. He was trapped, and he knew it. I stood up, my blazer falling perfectly into place. Tessa looked up at me, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. The country music singer on the bar's speakers was crooning about a cheating heart. "I'm leaving now," I said. "But the bill," she managed to say, gesturing at the 2 cocktails on the table. I looked from the bill to her, then to the designer handbag sitting on the seat beside her. "I'm sure your benefactor can cover it," I said. I turned and walked away without looking back. I didn't rush. Every step was measured, deliberate. As I pushed through the heavy wooden door of the gilded cage and stepped out into the cool, damp night air, I felt the slight weight of the button on my cuff. It was still running, still recording. A silent, digital witness. The interview was complete. I had the confession. I had the visual confirmation. I had everything I needed. The trap was almost ready to be sprung. The walk back from the gilded cage was not one of triumph. It was the calm, focused return of an operative who had successfully completed a phase of an intelligence-gathering mission. The video and audio from the button camera were already uploading to my secure cloud server as I walked. The deadline Neil Carr had given me, 6 a.m., was a ticking clock that sharpened my thoughts into crystalline points. The apartment was as I had left it, except for a conspicuous void in the master closet and an empty space on the bathroom counter where Caleb's things used to be. The silence he left behind was not an absence. It was a clean slate. My first act was not to review the new evidence, but to protect my own position. In a compliance investigation, the integrity of the investigator is paramount. Any hint of personal vendetta or conflict of interest could compromise the entire case. I was married to employee Y. My sister was associated third-party Z. I was financially entangled with employee Y's family. I was a walking, breathing conflict of interest. I had to formally and preemptively neutralize that. I logged into my personal bank portal and downloaded the complete statement for the previous month, highlighting the $80,000 wire transfer to the escrow attorney. I then drafted a formal memorandum addressed to Neil Carr. The subject line was Voluntary Disclosure of Potential Conflict, Case CID 774A9. In it, I detailed my marital relationship to employee Y and my familial relationship to third-party Z. I attached the bank statement and the signed loan agreement from Irene Rowan. I stated, in clear legal language, that I was providing this information to ensure full transparency and that I was prepared to recuse myself if he felt my involvement compromised the investigation's objectivity. It was a calculated risk. Neil could take me off the case. But I knew him. He valued results over appearances. By disclosing everything, I was inoculating myself and the case against future attack. I encrypted the memorandum and the attachments and sent them to his private email with a timestamp of 1:47 a.m. With my own position secured, I moved on to the next piece of the puzzle. The money trail. The $12,000 consulting fee was the key. I had the video of Tessa's tattoo, and her tacit admission that a benefactor was funding her new lifestyle. Now I needed to connect the dots with hard data. I put aside the corporate investigation for a moment and put on my private investigator hat. It took me less than an hour, using a series of commercially available data brokerage services and some educated guesses, to find what I was looking for. Tessa had paid for the handbag at a luxury boutique downtown using a brand new debit card. The issuing bank was a small, regional credit union. The account had been opened just 10 days prior. It was a classic pass-through account, designed for a single purpose. The crucial piece of information, however, came from a leaked database of retail transactions I had legitimate access to for fraud monitoring purposes. The timestamp of the handbag purchase was the day after Alderbridge submitted its invoice, just 4 hours after the funds would have cleared in their corporate account. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Now, I began to assemble the core of my report. I created a new, encrypted document on my workstation. This would be the formal report for Brightmoor's executive board and legal counsel. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic. Each piece of evidence was a block, and I was the architect, building an inescapable prison of facts. First, I built the timeline. Exhibit A, a screenshot of Caleb's email to AT, bypassing protocol to request temporary administrative access for an unnamed consultant. Time, 10:23 a.m., Thursday, 2 weeks prior. Exhibit B, the Secure Pass V4.1 visitor log, showing Tessa Carter being signed in by Caleb Rowan for a Rowan family matter. Time, 7:11 p.m. on the same Thursday. Exhibit C, a series of high-resolution stills from the lobby security camera, time-stamped at 7:13 p.m., showing Caleb and Tessa entering the secure area together. Exhibit D, a log from the elevator's internal access panel, showing Caleb's keycard being used to access the 21st floor, the location of the Nightingale Project's primary data server room. Time, 7:16 p.m. Exhibit E, a copy of the $12,000 invoice from Alderbridge for ad hoc consulting services, submitted to Brightmoor's accounts payable system. Timestamp, 9:04 a.m. the following morning. Exhibit F, the internal approval record, showing Caleb personally authorizing the payment of the invoice. Timestamp, 11:30 a.m. The sequence was airtight. It established opportunity and a clear breach of multiple corporate policies. Next, I connected the third party. Exhibit G, a screenshot of Tessa's Instagram post, featuring the designer handbag. The post's own timestamp was from that Friday evening. I ran a metadata analysis on the original image file, which I had scraped from the platform's public cache. While the geotag had been stripped, the image's EXIF data contained the make and model of the phone used, and a creation timestamp that was just hours after the handbag was purchased. Exhibit H, the retail transaction record, showing the purchase of the handbag and its price, timestamped to Friday afternoon. This linked the corporate payout from Brightmoor to Alderbridge with Tessa's sudden, otherwise inexplicable acquisition of a luxury item. With the corporate case laid out, I pivoted to protect myself on the personal front. I drafted a separate, formal affidavit. It was a sworn statement, to be notarized first thing in the morning. In it, I stated under penalty of perjury that the $80,000 I transferred to the Rowan family was a personal loan, that it was sourced from my personal, post-tax savings, and that it had absolutely no connection to any business, vendor, or project associated with Brightmoor Dynamics. This document was my shield. When the Rowans inevitably tried to claim the money was a gift, or worse, that it was somehow tied to the business dealings, this affidavit would be an unshakable legal firewall. My next step was to apply external pressure. A robust compliance strategy doesn't just address the internal threat. It anticipates external regulatory scrutiny. I opened a new, anonymous, end-to-end encrypted email account. I composed a message to the public whistleblower tip line of the Norham State Securities Commission. The email was brief, sterile, and devoid of emotion or accusation. To whom it may concern, I wish to draw your attention to a potential irregularity concerning procurement protocols for Project Nightingale. a state-funded healthcare data initiative. Brightmore Dynamics, NASDAQ, bar ID, has recently engaged a new subcontractor, Alderbridge Tech, a private entity. Note the following timeline. Date: a senior Brightmore employee, C. Rowan, authorized an unscheduled payment of $12,000 to Alderbridge Tech for vaguely defined consulting services. This payment coincided with a significant documented breach of data access and physical security protocols by the same employee. There may be an undisclosed personal relationship between the employee's family and a principal of the vendor. This information is provided in the public interest. No further contact will be made. I didn't sign it. I didn't provide any of my evidence. I simply planted a seed. The regulators had their own methods. They would start digging. It would be slow, but it would be relentless. The knowledge that an external investigation was imminent would put immense pressure on Brightmore to act decisively on my internal report. The report itself was nearly complete. 12 pages of cold, hard facts, cross-referenced and indexed. The title page was stark. Internal Compliance Review, CID 774A9. Subject: Potential Kickback Scheme via Related Party. Throughout the document, the coded identifiers, Employee Y, Vendor X, Third Party Z, ensured it read not like a personal vendetta, but like an impersonal, objective analysis of risk. I set a calendar appointment on my work phone for 7:45 a.m. Title: Pre-brief for Nightingale Steering Committee. Location: Neil Carr's office. The ambush was scheduled. As I printed a final copy of the report, I paused. The evidence was strong. The timeline was damning. But it was still, as Neil had pointed out, circumstantial. It showed a flow of money from Brightmore to Alderbridge and a subsequent, suspicious purchase by Tessa. But it didn't show the final, critical link: money moving from Alderbridge, or its principal Theron Vale, directly to Tessa or Caleb. I could infer it. A jury would likely believe it, but I wanted to prove it. I needed one more piece, one final, irrefutable exhibit that would turn a strong case into an open and shut conviction. I turned to the last page of my report, the appendix of exhibits. I typed one final entry, leaving the space next to it blank. Exhibit R. The R stood for Rowan. It was the missing link, the piece of the puzzle that was still in their possession. I didn't know what it was yet. A bank transfer, a hidden contract, a recorded conversation, but I knew it existed, and I knew, with the cold certainty of a hunter who has cornered her prey, that I would find it before the sun came up. The trap was built. All it needed was the final, perfect piece of bait. The report was a fortress of logic, but Exhibit R was a ghost. I had the means, motive, and opportunity, but I lacked the final, tangible proof of transfer from Vendor X to the Rowan conspiracy. I stared at the blank space on the appendix page. The information wasn't on a server or in a database. It was in their world, the messy, emotional world of family secrets. To get it, I would have to enter that world. I would have to go to the source. I would have to go to Irene. The clock on my dashboard read 3:12 a.m. The logical move was to sleep, to arrive at the 8 a.m. meeting sharp and rested. But my mind was running too hot. The hunt was all-consuming. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the missing piece was with her. She was the matriarch, the emotional center of the deception. She would also be its weakest point, her pride a vulnerability I could exploit. I needed a pretext. A Trojan horse. I drove to a 24-hour artisan bakery in a gentrified part of town, the kind of place that sold $15 croissants. I bought a box of their most elaborate pastries, a decadent assortment of fruit tarts and almond swirls. The box was tied with a thick, satin ribbon. It was a perfect symbol of peace and conciliation. It was a prop. Irene lived in a tidy suburban house with a manicured lawn and a flag by the front door. A single light was on in the downstairs living room. I rang the bell. It took a long moment for her to answer. When the door opened, she was wearing a silk dressing gown, her face a mask of carefully applied night cream. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock and suspicion. Ray, she said, her voice a low, hostile whisper. What in God's name are you doing here at this hour? I held up the box of pastries, forcing my face into an expression of weary contrition. I pitched my voice lower, softer, letting a slight tremor enter it. I'm sorry to come so late. Irene, I couldn't sleep. I needed to talk. I needed to understand. This was the bait. I was playing the role they had cast for me. The jilted, confused wife, seeking wisdom from the older, wiser woman who had replaced her. Her suspicion began to melt away, replaced by a look of smug, maternal pity. She was the victor. After all, she could afford to be magnanimous. Oh, you poor thing, she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Of course. Come in. Come in out of the cold. She led me into her immaculate dining room. It was her command center, the table polished to a mirror shine, and laid out on that table, under the dim light of a Tiffany-style lamp, was a collection of papers, a calculator, and a ledger. She had been working on the finances. My heart rate quickened, but I kept my expression placid. I just wanted to say, thank you, I began, placing the pastry box on the table. For taking Caleb in, for taking care of him. I know I've been distant, married to my job. I guess. I was feeding her the exact narrative Tessa had used, validating her entire worldview. Her smile was thin, tight. A man needs a wife, Ray, not a business partner. She gestured to the papers on the table. Speaking of which, running a family business is a full-time job, always something to take care of. My eyes scanned the documents discreetly. They were mostly invoices and receipts for Rowan & Sons HVAC, but one document was different. It was a partially completed quarterly tax filing. My eyes snagged on a single line in the expenditures section. It was a handwritten entry under the subcategory of charitable donations. The entry was for $5,000. The recipient, written in Irene's looping cursive, was the Alderbridge Community Fund. The world seemed to slow down. The air grew thick. Alderbridge, Community Fund, it was the missing link. But it was structured in a way I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't a simple kickback. It was more sophisticated. It was money laundering, sanitized through the immaculate vessel of a nonprofit organization. My mind raced, assembling the pieces. Alderbridge makes a charitable donation to a fund. That donation is a tax write-off for them. The fund, controlled by a friendly party, can then disperse money for its stated purpose. A community fund could, for instance, provide grants or financial assistance to struggling local families. Like, for instance, the family of a project manager who just approved a major contract for the fund's primary donor. I needed to confirm the structure. Keeping my hands steady, I pulled out my phone. I'm so sorry, I said, feigning a sudden thought. I just need to check one work email. It'll only take a second. Irene waved a dismissive hand, already basking in the glow of her perceived superiority. Of course, dear. You career girls are always on the clock. Under the cover of checking my email, I opened a web browser. I navigated to the Norham State Registry of Charitable Trusts. I typed Alderbridge Community Fund into the search bar. The result came up instantly. The fund was real. It had been incorporated just 2 months ago. Its stated mission was to provide economic support to small business owners and their families in the North Arden area. And listed under the section for Board of Directors, there was only one name, the founder and executive director, Irene Rowan. I had found it. The whole elegant, vicious machine. The money didn't flow from Alderbridge to Caleb or Tessa. It flowed from Alderbridge to Irene, laundered through the pristine image of a community charity. From there, she could distribute it however she saw fit. A new handbag for her daughter's new ally, a little extra cash for her son, all under the guise of philanthropy. It was brilliant, and I was about to burn it to the ground. I put my phone away, my face a mask of calm. I'm so impressed, Irene, I said, my voice filled with a newfound, genuine admiration. Running the business, and philanthropy too. What is the Alderbridge Community Fund? Her eyes lit up. She was proud of her creation. She launched into a prepared speech about giving back to the community, about how Theron Vale was a wonderful young man who wanted to support local businesses. As she spoke, she gestured to her iPad, which was sitting next to the tax forms. In fact, she said, her voice swelling with self-importance, Theron was so grateful for our partnership. He had his firm make a founding donation. He even sent us this lovely letter for our records. She tapped the screen of her iPad, and a PDF of a formal letter appeared. It was on Alderbridge Tech letterhead, confirming a generous donation and thanking the fund for its vital community work. It was signed by Theron Vale. That's wonderful, I said, my voice breathy with fake awe. It's so beautifully designed. Could I possibly get a copy? Just as a keepsake, to remember how a real family works. My performance was flawless. I was the broken woman, looking for a model to emulate. Her pride and ego could not resist the opportunity to gloat. Of course, dear, she said. She fumbled with the sharing options for a moment. Here, let me, I said, reaching over. AirDrop is the easiest way. I guided her finger to the icon, and a second later, the file transfer request appeared on my phone. I accepted it. The PDF, with all of its digital fingerprints, was now mine. As the file downloaded, I opened it on my phone. I wasn't just looking at the letter. I swiped up to view the file's properties, and there it was, glowing on my screen in the silent, predatory hours of the morning. The metadata. Creator, Theron Vale. Created with Microsoft Word for Mac. Last modified by T. Vale. This was Exhibit R, a direct digital link between the vendor's key account manager and the charitable fund controlled by my mother-in-law. Irene was watching me, a sly, knowing smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had won so completely that she could now reveal a small part of her hand. It's important to have friends in the right places, she said, her voice a low purr. Family takes care of family. Ray. I looked up from my phone, meeting her gaze directly. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face for the first time that night. Thank you. Irene, I said, my voice clear and steady, all trace of the broken wife gone. Thank you for the transparency. It's a core principle of good governance. She blinked, momentarily confused by the corporate jargon. I pressed my advantage. In fact, for your own tax records, you should really have a physical receipt for the business's donation, signed by the fund's director, for audit purposes. I gestured to the tax form. Let me just write one out for you now. It'll make your accountant's life much easier. Before she could process my shift in demeanor, I had pulled a blank receipt from a pad in her desk drawer. I filled it out quickly. Received from Rowan & Sons HVAC. Amount $5,000 for charitable donation. I pushed it across the table to her, along with a pen. If you could just sign here, as executive director of the Alderbridge Community Fund. She was so caught up in her own cleverness, so certain of her victory, that she saw my action as a final act of subservience, of me helping her with her paperwork. Without a moment's hesitation, she took the pen and signed her name with a flourish. I took the signed receipt, the ink still wet, and folded it carefully, placing it in my pocket. Exhibit R now had a physical, legally binding component. I stood up and pushed the box of untouched pastries toward her. Please, enjoy these, I said. I walked to the door, my mission complete. I paused with my hand on the knob and looked back at her. She was still sitting at the table, a queen surrounded by the architecture of her own downfall, a faint, puzzled look on her face. Thank you again for your time, Irene, I said. You've been incredibly helpful. I stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, the cold air a welcome shock. The wind whipped around me, but I didn't feel it. I felt only the satisfying weight of the signed receipt in my pocket and the cool, hard certainty of the digital file on my phone. The trap was now complete. All that was left was to spring it. The boardroom on the 28th floor was a glass box suspended in a gray, indifferent sky. The long obsidian table reflected the somber light, making it seem as if we were all floating in a cloud. Brightmoor's Executive Steering Committee, a collection of C-suite officers in sharp and dark suits, sat with the ramrod-straight posture of people who measured their days in millions of dollars. At the head of the table, our CEO, Marcus Thorne, presided with an unnerving stillness, his eyes missing nothing. I sat to Thorne's right. My position as head of compliance, Neil Carr, our general counsel, was beside me. On the opposite side of the table sat the visiting delegation, Theron Vale, the slick, confident face of Alderbridge Tech, flanked by two of his silent engineers, and sitting 2 chairs down from him, a part of the Brightmoor project team, was my husband, Caleb Rowan. He had not looked at me once since entering the room. He was intensely focused on the screen of his laptop, his knuckles white as he gripped its edges. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict. I had met with Neil at 7:45 a.m. sharp, as scheduled. I had walked him through the entirety of Exhibit R, the Alderbridge Community Fund, Irene's directorship, the donation from Rowan and Sons, the signed receipt, and the damning metadata on the PDF letter from Theron Vale. Neil's face had remained impassive, but his eyes had hardened into chips of ice. He simply said, "Wait for my signal." The meeting began with Theron Vale at the podium. He was a master of corporate theater, all charming smiles and confident gestures. He clicked through a presentation filled with buzzwords, synergistic frameworks, next-generation security protocols, agile data actualization. He spoke of Alderbridge's commitment, their passion, their unique ability to deliver what Project Nightingale needed. Caleb sat rigidly, nodding at the appropriate moments, a puppet performing his role in a play whose ending he couldn't control. Our integration process has been seamless, thanks to the diligent work of Caleb and his team, Theron said, gesturing magnanimously toward my husband. Caleb offered a tight, forced smile that didn't reach his terrified eyes. After 20 minutes of Theron's polished sales pitch, Marcus Thorne raised a hand. "Thank you, Mr. Vale. An impressive overview." He then turned his gaze to me. "Ray, you added an urgent item to the agenda. Risk and compliance update. The floor is yours." A quiet tension settled over the room. My updates were rarely good news. I stood and walked to the podium, my laptop connecting seamlessly to the main screen. The Alderbridge presentation vanished, replaced by the stark black and white title page of my report, Internal Compliance Review, CID 774A9. "Good morning," I began, my voice calm and measured. "My department has identified a series of procedural irregularities and a potential conflict of interest related to a new vendor engaged on Project Nightingale. To ensure objectivity, all parties will be referred to by coded identifiers." I saw Caleb flinch. Theron Vale's smile became fixed, a little strained. "We begin with Vendor X," I said, clicking to the next slide. It was a summary of Alderbridge's thin operational history. Onboarded 8 weeks ago at the recommendation of a senior project manager, Employee Y. I clicked again. Exhibit A appeared. Caleb's email to it. Employee Y initiated a breach of data access protocols, requesting high-level administrative credentials for an external consultant, bypassing a formal compliance review. Click the visitor logs. On the night the access was granted, Employee Y sponsored after-hours building access for an individual, Associated Third-Party Z, under a false name and a pretext of a family matter. The security stills of Caleb and Tessa in the lobby filled the screen. A low murmur went through the room. Caleb sank lower in his chair, his face ashen. Click the invoice. The following morning, Vendor X submitted an unscheduled invoice for $12,000 for ad hoc consulting services, which was personally and immediately approved by Employee Y. I paused, letting the implications of the timeline settle. These actions represent a significant breach of our corporate governance policies. However, the core of the issue is an undisclosed relationship that links all 3 parties. Theron Vale, who had been watching with growing alarm, decided to intervene. He stood up, forcing a chuckle. "Ms. Whitlock, while I appreciate your diligence, this seems like a series of administrative misunderstandings. Alderbridge is a small, agile company. Sometimes we move faster than the bureaucracy. We pride ourselves on our community engagement, on building relationships. In fact, we recently made a significant donation to a local community fund to show our commitment to North Arden." It was the signal. "The Alderbridge Community Fund, I presume?" I asked, my voice cutting through his sentence. He stopped, surprised. "Why, yes. How did you know?" "You mentioned it," I said. My finger pressed the button on my remote. Click. The screen changed. The invoice, the emails, the security photos, they all vanished. They were replaced by a single, high-resolution image. It was the Articles of Incorporation for the Alderbridge Community Fund, and there, under the title Executive Director, was the clear, unmistakable name, Irene Rowan. A collective intake of breath sucked the air from the room. Theron Vale stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. His face, moments before a mask of confident charm, was now pale and slack. Neil Carr leaned forward, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Mr. Vale, an interesting philanthropic endeavor," he paused. "I have a technical question. My team reviewed a thank you letter you sent to this fund. The PDF's metadata indicates that the document's creator and last person to modify it was T. Vale. Is that you?" Theron froze. His eyes darted from Neil, to the screen, to me. He was trapped. If he said yes, he admitted to creating a document for a fund directed by the mother of the project manager who was shoveling money to his company. If he said no, he was lying about a verifiable digital fact. He said nothing. His silence was an admission of guilt. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice relentless, "the name Irene Rowan establishes a direct familial link to employee Y." I looked directly at Caleb. For the first time, he met my gaze. His eyes were wide with panic and a dawning, horrified understanding. He hadn't just been caught in an affair. He had been caught in a conspiracy. The CEO, Marcus Thorne, swiveled his chair slowly to face Caleb. His voice was dangerously soft. "Caleb, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?" Caleb opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just stared. A man whose world had just been systematically dismantled in front of his board of directors. I turned back to the screen and advanced to my final slide. It contained only 3 bullet points under the heading Recommendations. Given the evidence of multiple policy violations, an undisclosed conflict of interest, and a potential kickback scheme designed to circumvent our financial controls, I recommend the following actions, effective immediately. I let each word land with the weight of a hammer blow. First, a complete and immediate suspension of all payments to Vendor X, pending the outcome of a full, independent forensic audit. Second, the immediate revocation of all project-related system and building access for employee Y and his direct reports. Third, that this preliminary report and all associated evidence be turned over to this board's external audit committee and the relevant regulatory authorities for further investigation. I finished and stood in silence, looking at Marcus Thorne. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Thorne looked from my face to Caleb's, then to the frozen, terrified face of Theron Vale. He then looked around the table at his executive team. "All in favor of the recommendations put forth by the head of compliance?" he asked, his voice flat. Every single hand around the table went up, not a moment of hesitation. "The motion passes unanimously," Thorne declared. He looked at Neil. "Neil, make the necessary calls. Freeze the contract. Lock his accounts." He then looked at Caleb, his expression one of utter contempt. "Caleb, you are suspended, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." It was over. In the space of 10 minutes, the entire Rowan Vale enterprise had been annihilated. Theron Vale was already gathering his things, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. Two security guards entered the room and stood silently behind Caleb's chair. The contract was frozen, the money was stopped, the conspiracy was dead, and it all happened right there, in the cold, gray light of the 28th floor. The boardroom cleared out with the quiet, predatory efficiency of a shark tank after a feeding. Theron Vale and his team were gone, their presentations left behind like the shed skin of a lesser animal. Caleb was escorted away, a ghost in his own life. Not looking back, I remained, standing with Neil Carr as we watched the gray clouds churn through the floor-to-ceiling windows. There was no celebration. The successful execution of a compliance protocol is not a victory. It is the restoration of order. The work was not over. It had simply moved into a new, more aggressive phase. "The board is insulated," Neil said, breaking the silence. "They'll form an independent committee. The audit will be brutal, and Brightmoor will cooperate fully with the SEC. We'll survive." He turned to me, his expression all business. "The first official communication with the Securities Commission needs to happen within the hour. I want your entire case file, every exhibit, transferred to my office. We will submit it under a good faith reporting provision. It shows we were proactive." "It's already packaged and encrypted," I replied. "Ready for transfer." "Good." He paused, his lawyerly mind already several steps ahead. "Now, for you, the $80,000 loan to the Rowan family, we disclosed it, which protects the company. But you need to protect yourself. That money is now a potential point of leverage they will try to use against you, to tie you to their mess. You need to formally separate that personal liability from this corporate investigation, immediately." "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "File a separate action," he said, his voice sharp. "Now, today, a civil suit for repayment of the loan. Keep it simple. A straightforward breach of a loan agreement. It establishes a clear legal firewall between your personal finances and this corporate malfeasance. It proves you are not a co-conspirator. You are their creditor. Another victim. It changes the narrative." I nodded. Understood. He was right. The personal and the professional had to be surgically separated. Two distinct fronts in the same war. I returned not to my apartment, but to my office. The first order of business was the official demand for repayment. I drafted a formal letter to Irene Rowan, Executive Director of the Alderbridge Community Fund. It was not a plea, it was a legal instrument. It cited the date of our email correspondence, the agreed-upon terms, and the digitally signed acknowledgement of the personal loan. It stated that due to a fundamental breach of trust, I was exercising my right to call the loan due in full, effective immediately. I gave her 72 hours to remit payment of $80,000. I sent it via a trackable, certified courier to her home address, and emailed a digital copy to the address she had used to return the signed PDF. Her response came less than an hour later, a reply to my email. It was short, arrogant, and precisely the piece of evidence I needed. "You will never see a single dime of that money. It was a gift to your husband's family. Try to take it, and you will regret it." It was a declaration of war. It was also a direct refutation of the legally binding document she had signed. I attached her email as a new exhibit, Exhibit S for Stupid, to my file. Then, I logged into the Norham County Civil Court's online portal and filed a petition for repayment. It was a simple, boilerplate filing. Plaintiff: Ray Whitlock. Defendant: Irene Rowan. Cause of action: breach of contract. Amount: $80,000, plus interest and legal fees. And to this simple petition, I attached a single, powerful exhibit, a copy of the Articles of Incorporation for the Alderbridge Community Fund, showing her as the sole director. The implication was clear. I was not just suing a private citizen, I was suing the director of a questionable charity that was currently the subject of a major corporate fraud investigation. I was showing the court that she had access to a suspicious flow of funds. The filing was a tactical nuke. While the legal machinery began to grind on that front, I opened the second. Caleb. He was now at his most vulnerable. Unemployed, disgraced, and facing potential criminal charges. His instinct would be to lash out, to drag me into a messy, protracted divorce, to fight over every asset out of pure spite. I decided to offer him a cleaner, faster way out, a way that would serve my own purposes. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with my personal attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Julia who specialized in contentious divorces. Together, we drafted a post-nuptial agreement. It was a surgical strike. It proposed a simple, clean division of assets. I would keep the apartment we shared and my own car. He would keep his car and his personal effects. It stipulated that we would both waive any claim to the other's retirement accounts. In exchange for his signature, I would agree to an uncontested, no-fault divorce to be filed in 60 days, with no public allegations of infidelity on my part. It seemed like a generous offer, too generous, but Julia had drafted the poison pill with exquisite precision. The final clause, Section 9B, was the entire point of the exercise. It stated that if, within the first 30 days following the execution of the agreement, Caleb Rowan publicly acknowledged, through social media, press, or any other public forum, a romantic relationship with Tessa Whitlock, he would forfeit all claims to the shared apartment and his vehicle, with the titles transferring immediately and irrevocably to me. It was a trap built on his own arrogance and my sister's desperate need for validation. He would see the agreement as a way to avoid a messy fight, to get out clean. He wouldn't believe I would enforce the clause, or more likely, he wouldn't be able to stop himself. They would want to gloat. They would need to announce their victory to the world. I sent the draft to the personal email address of Caleb's lawyer, a man I knew he kept on retainer. The subject line was, "Proposal for amicable dissolution." The unspoken threat was clear. Sign this, or I will add your adultery and potential conspiracy to the mountain of legal trouble you are already under. For the rest of the afternoon, there was silence. Then, at 4:52 p.m., an email arrived from his lawyer. It contained a single attachment, the post-nuptial agreement, executed with Caleb's digital signature. He had taken the bait. He thought he was getting out easy. That evening, I sat in the silent apartment, a glass of water on the table beside me, my laptop open, and at 9:17 p.m., it happened. My phone buzzed with a notification. A friend had tagged me in a post. It was from Tessa's Luxe Instagram account. The picture was of her and Caleb, clinking champagne glasses in a ridiculously expensive-looking restaurant. They were smiling, beaming with a kind of defiant joy. Caleb's arm was wrapped possessively around her. The caption was a single, triumphant sentence. Out of the darkness and into the light. So excited for our new beginnings. I took a high-resolution screenshot. I saved the image, the caption, the username, and the timestamp. I opened the black notebook on my desk, the one where this had all begun. I turned to a new page and made a simple, dated entry. Day 0, Public Acknowledgement Clause, Section 9B, triggered. The final piece of the legal puzzle clicked into place. The next morning, the sky opened up, a torrential downpour that washed the grime from the city streets. At 8:00 a.m., sharp, a licensed and bonded locksmith arrived at my apartment. I showed him my ID and the newly executed post-nuptial agreement, specifically the section granting me sole and exclusive rights to the residence. He worked quickly and efficiently, replacing the main lock and the deadbolt. He handed me a set of new, gleaming silver keys. As he was packing up his tools, I saw a taxi pull up across the street. Caleb got out. He was wearing the same suit from the day before, now rumpled and sad. He looked up at the apartment, then started across the street, his head down against the driving rain. He reached the front door of the building and fumbled for his keys. I watched from the window as he tried the old key in the new lock. It wouldn't fit. He tried again, jiggling it with a growing sense of frustration. Finally, he looked up at the lock itself. A flicker of confusion, then dawning horror, on his face. He looked up toward my window, and for a moment, our eyes met through the rain-streaked glass. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I simply stood there, holding my new set of keys, and watched as the man who had been my husband stood locked out in the rain. a pathetic, drenched casualty of a war he never understood he was fighting. 30 days. That was the length of the fuse I had given them. 30 days for the post-nuptial agreement to solidify, for the SEC's quiet inquiries to gain traction, for the initial shock of the Brightmoor implosion to curdle into true, desperate fear. And in that time, just as I predicted, their arrogance overwhelmed their caution. They needed to prove to their world and to themselves that they had won, so they planned a party. It was billed as an engagement party. The venue was the Lake Crest, a restaurant that perched on the edge of the water, its panoramic windows reflecting the last, bloody streaks of the sunset. I received an invitation, a thick cardstock affair delivered by courier, a clear act of provocation. Come and witness our happiness. Come and see what you have lost. They had no idea I was coming to collect a debt. I walked in alone. The room was a sea of warm, golden light, white roses, and the clinking of champagne glasses. A hired photographer's flashbulb popped, momentarily bleaching the scene of its color. Tessa was the center of it all, radiant in a white dress that was too bridal for an engagement party, her hand permanently attached to Caleb's arm. Caleb looked haunted, his smile a brittle facade, but he played his part. They were a tableau of perfect, stolen happiness. I took a glass of water from a passing waiter and found a quiet spot near the back, a position from which I could observe the entire room. I was an anomaly, a ghost at their feast, and my presence sent small ripples of unease through the crowd. But the evening's master of ceremonies, Irene Rowan, was about to begin. She tapped a knife against her glass, and a hush fell over the room. She stood, beaming, a proud matriarch surveying her domain. I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate this wonderful new beginning for Caleb and Tessa, she began, her voice resonating with false sincerity. As a mother, you only want to see your children happy, to see them find their rightful place in the world. She paused, her eyes finding mine in the crowd for a fraction of a second, a glint of pure, triumphant malice in them. Sometimes, the path is winding. Sometimes, you have to let go of things that are holding you back to find your way home. Family is about gratitude, and I am so grateful to Tessa. She placed a hand on my sister's shoulder. For having the strength and love to bring my son back to where he belongs. A polite, enthusiastic round of applause filled the room. Caleb and Tessa kissed for the cameras. It was the perfect cue. As the applause died down, I began to walk forward, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor. A path seemed to clear for me. All eyes were on me. The wronged wife, the specter they had tried to exorcise. I smiled, a calm, pleasant, utterly disarming smile. That was a beautiful speech, Irene, I said, my voice carrying easily in the sudden quiet. It's so important to celebrate family, and in that spirit, I've brought a gift. I held up a simple, elegant white envelope. In the top left corner, in crisp, professional lettering, was the logo for the Alderbridge Community Fund. I saw a flicker of confusion, then alarm, in Irene's eyes. Caleb went rigid. Tessa's smile faltered. I handed the envelope to Irene. For the happy couple, I said. Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. She expected a legal notice, a threat, but as her fingers opened the flap, she found nothing inside. It was empty. She looked up at me, confused. Oh, the gift isn't in the envelope, I said sweetly. It's for everyone to share. I raised a small remote in my other hand and pressed a single button. On the far wall, a massive, high-definition LED screen, which had been displaying a tasteful slideshow of photos of the happy couple, flickered and went dark. A moment later, it lit up again, no longer with soft-focus portraits, but with the cold, hard graphics of a corporate compliance report. The first image was a still from the Brightmoor lobby camera. Exhibit C, Caleb and Tessa, his hand on her back, time-stamped and dated. A low murmur started to spread through the room. The image changed. A split screen. On one side, the visitor log showing Tessa Carter signed in for a Rowan family matter. On the other, The invoice from Alderbridge for $12,000. The screen changed again. This time, it was a screenshot of the metadata from the thank you letter PDF. The words, Creator Theron Vale, were circled in red. I saw Theron, who was standing near the bar, physically recoil as if struck. The final image appeared. It was the Articles of Incorporation for the Community Fund, with Irene Rowan's name clearly visible as executive director, and next to it, I had superimposed a high-resolution scan of the donation receipt she had signed in her own dining room, her own signature, magnified to fill a third of the screen. Dead silence. The only sound was the mournful notes of a lone cello from the hired string quartet, the musician not yet realizing the party was over. The guests, a mix of family friends and business associates of the Rowans, stared at the screen, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The party wasn't a celebration. It was an exhibit in a fraud trial, and they were the jury. Theron Vale's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his face already pale. He looked at the screen and all remaining color drained from his face. It wasn't Brightmore's legal team. It was worse. It was his own lawyer. The SEC's informal inquiry had just become a formal investigation. He stumbled back, turning and pushing his way out of the room without a word. I turned my attention back to the stage. I just want to thank Caleb and Tessa for providing such a clear, public confirmation of their relationship, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. And Irene, thank you for clarifying the link between your family, your son's project, and your vendor's philanthropic arm. I know the Securities and Exchange Commission will deeply appreciate this level of transparency. A low, guttural sound, like a wounded animal, came from Caleb, Tessa's hand, which was raising a champagne flute to her lips in a gesture of nervous habit, began to tremble violently. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. I let my gaze settle on the matriarch. Irene Rowan stood frozen, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief and rage. The smug victor of a moment ago was gone, replaced by a cornered, terrified old woman. I believe we have one last piece of business. Irene, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate tone. The $80,000, now that your other sources of funding may be compromised, I'm prepared to be flexible. Would you prefer to settle the debt by check, or should I give you the wire transfer details? She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She was utterly broken. And then, another figure stepped out from the side of the room. My lawyer, Julia, dressed in a severe, dark suit, holding a leather-bound portfolio. She had been waiting in the restaurant's private dining room, precisely as we had planned. She walked up to Irene's table and opened the portfolio, placing a single document on the white linen tablecloth. Mrs. Rowan, Julia said, her voice crisp and devoid of all emotion. This is a settlement agreement. It offers you the chance to repay the $80,000 loan, plus interest and fees, in full, tonight, in return for which, my client, Ms. Whitlock, will drop her civil suit against you. She paused, letting the offer sink in. If you decline, the suit proceeds in the morning, and Exhibit R, which you see on the screen, will be a central part of our argument that you engaged in a conspiracy to defraud my client and have access to illicit funds. I suggest you sign. The air in the room was thick with the wreckage of the party. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and fled, the remaining guests huddled in small, whispering groups, their eyes darting between the frozen tableau on the stage and the damning evidence still glowing on the LED screen. Irene Rowan stood trapped between the public humiliation on the screen and the private legal annihilation offered on the paper in front of her. The choice was an illusion. There was no escape, only different methods of execution. Her face, a moment ago a mask of fury, had collapsed into a gray, slack-jawed portrait of defeat. She stared at the settlement agreement as if it were a venomous snake. Julia, my attorney, stood by impassively, a silent sentinel of consequence. Irene looked from the paper to my face, her eyes pleading for a different reality, one where she still held the power. She found nothing in my expression but the calm, steady finality of a closed ledger. I don't have that kind of money available right now, she stammered, her voice a reedy whisper. It was her last, pathetic gambit, a play for time. Julia didn't even blink. That is not a concern of ours, she said, her voice like chipping ice. However, to facilitate the transaction and avoid any further delays, we've taken the liberty of arranging for a mobile payment terminal from your business's merchant bank. I'm sure you'll have the necessary account access. On cue, the restaurant manager, who had been hovering nervously nearby, walked forward. He was followed by a young man in a bank uniform, holding a sleek black handheld device, a mobile point-of-sale machine. He placed it carefully on the white linen tablecloth, right next to the shattered remains of Tessa's champagne glass. He powered it on. A small green LED blinked to life, a beacon of secure connection in the ruins of their lives. Irene stared at the machine. It was a mundane object, the kind used in 1,000 transactions a day, but here, tonight, it was an instrument of judgment, a guillotine made of plastic and circuits. She looked at Caleb, a desperate, silent appeal. He just stared back, his face a hollow mask of terror. He was useless to her now. He was baggage. With a shaking hand, her gaudy rings clinking against the table, Irene reached for the machine. The young banker politely guided her through the transaction, his voice a low, professional murmur that was an obscene counterpoint to the high drama of the moment. She had to key in the amount herself. Julia dictated the number, a cold calculation of the original $80,000, plus compounded interest, and a non-negotiable fee to cover all legal costs. The final sum was significantly larger. Each tap of a number on the keypad was a small death. She swiped her business bank card. She signed her name on the small digital screen with a trembling finger, her once proud signature now a spidery scrawl of capitulation. There was a moment of electronic silence. Then, a low whirring sound filled the room as a long, thin slip of paper spooled out of the top of the machine. The receipt. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of my victory, the sound of their complete and total ruin. At the exact same moment, my phone, which I had placed face up on a nearby table, vibrated. The screen lit up with a notification from my bank. The preview was simple and beautiful. Deposit received. Account ending in... I picked up the phone. I took a screenshot of the confirmation and saved it to the secure folder on my server. The folder was labeled Rowan. I renamed it. Rowan, closed. And in another corner of the digital universe, a second electronic domino fell. A synchronized email, triggered by my lawyer the moment the settlement was signed, was delivered to Caleb Rowan's personal account. The sender was the clerk of the Norham County Court. The subject line was stark. Notice of temporary order of enforcement. Post-nuptial agreement case 78B 921. He would open it to find that, due to the public acknowledgement clause he had triggered, his legal claim to the apartment and his car had been formally and summarily extinguished. The restaurant manager, seeing the transaction was complete, approached me with a deferential bow of his head. "Ma'am," he whispered, "with your permission, may I turn off the screen now?" Half the room was empty, the remaining guests looking like wax figures in a museum of disaster. "Yes," I said. "The presentation is over." He nodded, and a moment later, the screen went black, plunging that side of the room into a merciful darkness. I walked over and picked up the printed receipt from the table. The paper was still warm. I folded it once, neatly, and held it in my hand. I looked up and met Irene's gaze. She was watching me, her face utterly blank, the smirk, the condescension, the smug superiority. It had all been burned away. There was nothing left but the ashes of her arrogance. A sudden sharp movement broke the tableau. Tessa. Her face was a twisted mask of rage and disbelief. "You," she hissed, her voice a venomous screech. "You did this. You ruined everything." She lunged forward, her hands clawed, intending to... What? To hit me? To scratch me? It didn't matter. She never reached me. Caleb, in a rare moment of intelligent self-preservation, grabbed her arm and yanked her back. "Tessa, no! Stop!" he pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. He wasn't protecting me. He was protecting himself from the consequences of yet another one of their catastrophic mistakes. He held her as she struggled, her beautiful white dress now looking like a pathetic costume, her face ugly with impotent fury. I watched them for a moment, the two architects of their own destruction. Now just a pathetic, flailing mess. I had no more words for them. My business here was concluded, but as I turned to leave, I knew there was a microphone somewhere, a cell phone recording this final scene for the gossip pages. The story needed a final line, a thesis statement. I turned my head slightly, my voice not raised, but pitched to be perfectly, clearly audible. "I don't want your family," I said, the words dropping like stones into the silent room. "I wanted my money back." I walked past them, past the empty tables, and the wilting white roses. The glass doors of the restaurant slid open automatically, and a gust of cool, clean night air washed over me. The rain had stopped. The city glittered, a web of a million lights, indifferent and beautiful. I held the receipt in my hand. The flimsy piece of thermal paper felt heavier than a block of gold. It was not just a record of a financial transaction. It was a closing statement. It was the period at the end of a long and difficult sentence. It was the price of my freedom. The frame froze, a close-up on the receipt, my fingers holding it steady and sure. Cut to black. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect. Feel free to share your thoughts on Ray's journey. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support the story, hit that hype button to help it reach more listeners like you.